I've had the good fortune in my life of inventing 6 different life-saving technologies. I'm genuinely proud of that. Here's one of those stories. It was 2011. This is Sunday in the week prior to the US Thanksgiving holiday. And I'm a relatively new parent. My son had, we had actually a second time relatively new parent. So we had a little baby at home, but my son was turning from 3 to 4. And I'm giving him a bath. And for those of you who are a little younger, something you might eventually learn as a parent is icky stuff comes out of little kids. Like if there's an orifice, something unpleasant eventually is going to come out of that orifice. You only really worry when the wrong thing is coming out of the wrong hole. So kids throw up and kids poop and babies do awful things in, I know, snicker, do awful things in bathtubs. And after a little while, you just sort of clean them off, refill the bath, and you start over again. So he throws up in the bath. No big deal. I empty the bath, clean him up, we start over again. He throws up again. Uh-oh, probably got the flu. I am the child of a doctor, so the last thing I'm ever going to do is drag my kid to the emergency room. Never, never, never want to be one of those parents. The next day, he's still sick. Seems maybe even a little more sick. He just hasn't been eating. When you're not feeling good and you just got no appetite. So we do check in with his pediatrician, just by phone. I said, don't worry about it. Sounds like the flu. Just keep us up to date. By that Wednesday, he can't stand up anymore. And he's completely delirious. And it's the Wednesday before a 4-day holiday. And obviously, now we're really concerned. He hasn't really eaten anything in 4 days. He can't stand up, and he's delirious. So we rush him over to his pediatrician's office. Turns out they don't even need to run a test. They can smell that his sweat is sweet. So my son has type 1 diabetes. We didn't have a family history, so it sort of just came out of nowhere for us. And it was a real shock. Now, I'm the kind of person that does what my doctor says. If my doctor wants me to take something seriously, I take it seriously. If they say, don't worry about it, I don't worry about it. So they say, listen, relax, everything's going to be okay. They're expecting you at Oakland Children's Pediatric Hospital, but just take your time, get over there. I've gotten the message. Don't worry about it, it's going to be okay, take your time. So I stop to pick up the goose we'd ordered for Thanksgiving. Yeah, we're kind of, like I said, we're kind of weirdos, so I ordered a goose. Goose is an interesting thing. So I pick up the food. By the time we actually get to the hospital, they have called the sheriff's office because they're certain that we're smeared across a roadway somewhere. No, I just took my doctor seriously, which is take your time and don't worry about it. What they really thought was I would be wildly panicked and they were trying to calibrate. No, tell Vivienne exactly what you mean because she's borderline autistic and will simply do exactly what you say. So we finally get there, and I had the worst 4 days of my life. I've had some bad ones, but I spent 4 days on a cot next to my son's bed in the intensive care unit at Oakland Children's Hospital. Now that is really level setting because while we're having a horrible experience, there are little babies there with tubes coming out of their chests. There are families, I don't want to get too emotional, but there are families there visiting for the very last time. So we had a terrible 4 days. I do not recommend Thanksgiving dinner in any hospital anywhere. But we got to leave as a whole family. If you're wondering why, by the way, it takes 4 days, because it turns out, if you don't know what type 1 diabetes is, it's an autoimmune disorder. Your immune system destroys the cells that make insulin. Without insulin, the sugar in your bloodstream, you can eat all you want, it can't get inside your cells. So what your body starts doing is eating itself, turning its own fat and muscle into energy. Fat is okay. Muscle turns your blood acidic. It's called ketoacidosis. So literally, like out of the movie Aliens, my son's blood is getting acidic. That's what's actually killing him. And if they simply dumped a bunch of insulin in his bloodstream, he'd die of shock. So they have to slowly titrate it down over a few days. All right, so this is horrible. But we make it out together. And by the way, we weren't even the only ones there. There were 3 other families going through the same thing, one of whom didn't get to leave as a whole family. This is how it's often called pediatric diabetes, and this is often how people learn, is you get to spend some days in the hospital, and hopefully everything turns out okay. So this was this terrible experience that we had. And then we get home, and my wife and I are both scientists. So we start collecting all this information about our son. Everything he ate to the gram. So we had a Google spreadsheet, and the first line of that spreadsheet, which I still have, is goose, 89 grams. And mashed potatoes, 169 grams, and so forth. In fact, it wasn't just grams. I built a bunch of web crawlers, and they went through the US FDA website, and then the Hong Kong equivalent, because we're big on dim sum, and it collected the fat, carbohydrate, and protein contributions. Once you have those, you kind of have the basic profile of a food. For diabetes, what we care about is the carbohydrates, the sugars and like. But it turns out, more fat, more protein, sugars get absorbed more slowly. So we're recording all of this stuff. So much so, this is just relatively early days for Google Docs, it was regularly crashing. We were putting so much in there because we weren't just recording everything he ate to the gram with a breakdown of carbohydrates and proteins. We were recording whether he had the sniffles. There were no smartwatches back then per se, but I got, strangely enough, Intel made a prototype smartwatch called a Basis Band. So I got a hold of one of those, and we were obviously measuring his blood glucose levels, taking little blood samples over and over again. All of this data was going into this spreadsheet. And then we have our first outpatient visit with his doctors, people I genuinely liked, his endocrinologist and the support team. And I emailed them all of this data, thinking they're gonna love me. Oh, the dream, parents that actually collect all this data and share it with us, it's gonna change everything. And I don't hear back from them, but I get it. They're old school, right? These are doctors who probably got trained a while ago. So I print up, all right, some of you will get the reference. I print up like a phone book thick set of printer spreadsheets. For those of you who don't know what a phone book is, or for that matter, a library, these are things that used to exist and they were big. So I print up all of this paper with all of these numbers on it. I bring it in, slam it down in front of them, and they're angry with me. Angry that I'm wasting their time. What are we supposed to do with all this? So instead, they give us a single sheet of paper. And out of the probably 15,000 numbers that we had recorded, they had us write 15. Blood glucose levels for the morning, afternoon, and evening for 5 days. And then they took that sheet of handwritten numbers. Diabetes isn't just a bunch of handwritten numbers anymore, but this was 2011. This wasn't an age ago. They took those, and then they just sort of squinted at them and said, okay, here's what we're going to do for the next 6 months. And I thought, you have got to be kidding me. I build models of brains. Are you telling me the pancreas is more complex than the brain? There's this little set of cells in your pancreas, the islets of Langerhans, that's where insulin gets made. It's complicated. But, I mean, the real story is the pancreas is exactly as complicated as the brain because they're all interconnected together. It's just a giant immunometabolic mess, but let's not get too caught up in the details. I was beside myself. As horrible as the hospital experience was, I thought it was crazy that they couldn't make some kind of use of this data. And we were told, you can't control everything, you just relax and do the best you can. Oh, I didn't become a scientist to relax and just do the best I can, especially not when it's my own son. So that night I bought a book on endocrinology. Yeah, I took like a neuroendocrinology course during my PhD, but somewhat ironically, I slept through a lot of it because I'm a computational neuroscientist, and we don't have to know any of that nonsense. We make fake brains on computers and just teach them how to do things, which turns out is there's so much less blood, and it's just way better. It turns out none of the... I was once told by Jack Gallant, a notable neuroscientist at UC Berkeley, I know what you theoreticians all think. You think we're stupid, and maybe you're a little right. But we think you're lazy, and we are definitely right. And they are. Theoretical neuroscience, just substitute the word lazy for theoretical. But essentially imagine theoretical physics, but for the brain. Start with math, see if you can make the brain work. All right, so this is what I'm confronted with. So I buy this book on endocrinology, we skim through it, and the next day, I hack all of my son's medical equipment, which turns out breaks a whole bunch of US federal regulations. You're really not supposed to hack medical equipment. But it turns out if you do it to your own kids, no one really gets upset about it. So I did this, and then I redirected that flow of data from his watch, from his insulin pump, and from what's called a continuous glucose monitor, which, by the way, he keeps on his arm, that's why I'm referencing here, which every 5 minutes spits out a number, an estimate of how much sugar is in his bloodstream. And sent it all to my server. And then I took a model from the rabbit retina. So essentially, this is a model of how retinas work in general, and for whatever reason, the rabbit retina is just an interesting animal model case. Turns out, if you want to understand vision, the easiest thing to do is predict the future. Predict the image that will come next. I'm looking at you now. Probably it's going to look a lot like this next time, so why don't you just predict what I'm going to see over here, and then you only have to encode what's different, which isn't that much. So people built this model, and I said, well, that's kind of what I want to do. I want to predict the future. What will my son's blood glucose level be in an hour or in 3 hours? And so I built this model, and it worked. And I could see what my son's likely blood glucose level would be an hour. If my model said it's going to go high or it's going to go low with a certain confidence interval, it would. It was so cool. I built myself a superpower. In fact, I built it to send updates to my Google Glass, which some of you are probably too young to remember this, but this was a wearable glasses that had a little computer in it. It was Google's first swing at this a few years ago. It got a lot of attention in the news at the time, and Google had given me an early release pair to come up with ideas of what to do with it. By the way, none of which they implemented, but we'll come back to that in a moment. So I was getting real-time updates on this display of what my blood's, not his current blood glucose level will be, but what it will be in the next 3 hours. And if you're a parent, what an amazing thing to be able to do for yourself. So amazing that the last pair I have, which I still have at home, is sort of fluorescent blue. I got invited to a swanky party at the White House. This was a while ago, when it was white, not orange. And so this was an Obama-era event. In fact, President Obama and Vice President Biden were both at this party. And my wife and I show up, and I swear I asked permission from the Secret Service. They clearly had no idea what they were agreeing to, so I'm wearing a fluorescent blue computer on my face at this fancy dress party at the White House. And not being a particularly social person, everyone crams into this room. This is in the East Wing, a thing which no longer exists. There's a hole in the ground there now. Really nice. Everyone's crammed in to hear President Obama give a talk, and my wife and I are like, who needs it? So we went into another room where they had all the hors d'oeuvres laid out. And the food was really pretty good. And here's a tip to the younger of you that haven't learned this yet. A party doesn't have to end just because you've left the building. So we're taking some of these hors d'oeuvres and putting them in our purses. And while I'm doing this, I promise we're going to come full circle here. While I'm doing this, this enormous man, like take the three of you, cram them together, maybe add like this huge guy with the little curly Q thing coming out of his ears, a Secret Service agent, comes walking up. And of course, the first thing I think is, oh, we're getting busted for stealing food from the White House. But actually, he says, is that Google Glass? And I said, yeah. And it takes photos. Yeah. It does video. Now I'm thinking, like, does he want me to hook him up with Google so he can get his own pair? But actually, in the end, he just says, please don't live stream the president. That's it, on your honor. Little did I know that the Secret Service had freaked out when they saw that I was inside the White House with both the president and vice president with a, in theory, live camera on my head. In reality, the battery could not possibly be on all the time, but nonetheless, they were beside themselves. So it turns out my name now appears in Secret Service policy about what you're allowed to do at the White House, and you're not allowed to be a cyborg. So that's fun, but it turns out they asked the President of the United States whether they should kick me out of his party, and instead, later in the evening, this guy in a very fancy dress walks up to me. He says, take one step back, stay right here. And then my wife and I look up, and everyone else is getting pushed away by the Secret Service. This little door opens, and President Obama pops out. And he looks at me, and he just shakes his head like a disappointed dad. And there's a whole story here, but my first words to the President of the United States was, okay, Glass, take a picture. Because it was voice activated. So Google has confirmed I took the first and only presidential portrait ever taken with Google Glass. It is a terrible photograph, a real testament to why that was such a successful product. Did not improve his opinion of me at all. But then I got to tell him why I was wearing Google Glass. Because an hour before, I'd gotten a message from my own AI telling me my son Felix's blood sugar would go low in an hour. So I sent a text message to my sister, who was looking after him. She gave him a cracker and didn't go low. I also got to take the same Google Glass and build a system. My introduction to AI, believe it or not, my undergraduate honors thesis was a neural network that analyzed people's faces in 1999 to tell the difference between a real and a fake smile, based on $5 million of funding from the CIA to do lie detection. Morally gray at best. We got to later take that, extend it, and build a system for autistic children to learn how to read facial expressions in natural interactions with other people. And then a little later still, I got to take what I had learned about facial recognition and build a little game called Sexy Face, where people would choose which faces they thought were sexy and make judgments about it. But what they didn't know is they were training our model to be able to understand how people perceive faces. And then we use that model to reunite orphan refugees with their extended family members. And I got to tell the President of the United States about this. He still thought I was a crazy person because he is perceptive. But once I had built my, as it turns out, first ever AI for diabetes, I also got to just give it away. No strings attached, no patents, no licensing fees. I got on the phone with Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk and anyone that would take my calls, gave talks actually at both of those, and told them how to build it. I also told them that I told their main competitor how to build it too. That system to reunite orphan refugees, turns out orphan refugees are terrible customers. Not a lot of disposable income. Not a good startup plan. But you cannot imagine a worse experience. To be able to be reunited with someone that knows you and can love you is transformative. Or giving autistic kids, again, like my own son, the opportunity to understand what other people are thinking is amazing. If you can do this for another person, build them what is for them a superpower. Maybe sometimes that makes some money. This year, I launched my 13th company. But that's never why I start something. I start a project because it should exist. I fund them out of my own pocket, and my goal is to give them away. The biggest thing you can do in the world is, let me put it this way. If you want an amazing life, you have to give it to someone else. Actually, I'm writing a book about that very phenomenon. And one of the superpowers you can have, all of you are fostering, is being an inventor. Inventing something that can change your life, your family's life, anyone's life around the world. And if you build a company around that, great. And if you're an academic and you license this out, that's wonderful. And if you give it away, that's great too. What matters is you've built something to make the world better. And the hard part is not the inventing of the technology. In the end, the hard part is understanding the problem. What is it that you're solving? Strangely enough, diabetes was easy, but it wasn't like I invented anything truly dramatic from a machine learning standpoint. I used an existing model. It's just no one thought you could predict blood glucose levels, diabetes. It would just seem chaotic and random. With the autistic kids, people were using flashcards of cartoon faces. No one really thought, maybe during active social engagement, kids could actually learn what's going on inside the heads of other people. And it's known as perspective taking or theory of mind. Understanding the human problem, that's the transformative part. The technology, geek out all you want. You have solved the problem when people's lives are better. So I know we're pretty much out of time for questions, or just I should shut up. 2 questions. So I've tried to prep you for having some ideas of questions. Again, it can be on anything. We can get nerdy, we can have fun, whatever you want. But I just really want to leave you with this. There's this old saying that when the world gets better when old men plant trees. And the idea is, of course, they're never going to rest under its shade, so it doesn't make any sense for them to do it. It's not going to benefit them. And yet the world nonetheless gets better. Turns out you don't have to wait to be old. Anyone can plant trees. And I think you all are already starting on that. But if you haven't, or if you're thinking this is just a little thing I'm going to do, for my college application, no. Genuinely, tonight, start planting trees. Do something simply because it should happen. My whole career has been a long series of terrible career decisions. You would be appalled at the job offers I have turned down in my life. And yet, every time I do something dumb, like not be the chief scientist of Amazon, my life gets better. Honestly, because other people's lives get better. Please, tonight, go plant a tree. All right, let's find some questions. Who has anything at all? By the way, we have one here. I want someone on the younger end to ask the next question. That sounds terrifying, I know. Just step up, think of anything. I promise you, we will make it a good question. Yeah?
So my question is that if you have the opportunity to redesign the university admissions, you just spoke about that, what would you measure instead of grades and standardized tests?
So go ahead, you got a mic now?
Sorry.
For the recording.
So my question is that if you had an opportunity to redesign the university admissions, what would you measure instead of grades and standardized tests?
So 2 of my companies have been in using AI in education, which, by the way, in 2008, no one wanted to fund education, no one knew what AI was, certainly no one wanted to fund me. And then I became the chief scientist of one of the very first companies doing AI in hiring. I had a data set of 122 million people, and we looked at what predicted in the kids in my education research, positive life outcomes. And then the companies, we looked at what predicted career progression. And they were essentially the same things, and almost none of it was the university you went to. Now, that isn't saying universities don't matter. If you got a CS degree from MIT, that was a meaningful positive predictor. But it turns out a bigger positive predictor for the quality of code you write is your resilience. And strangely enough, we found social skills were equally predictive for software developers as they were for salespeople. Much less common, but just as predictive. So if I were looking at university admissions, and this is a thing right now with the UC system where I'm at, which is we got rid of the SATs. SATs have value. Any test is going to have some degree of value. But it turns out it doesn't do a good job of predicting positive long-term life outcomes. A lot of academic tests predict what comes next by design. What predicts longevity, all-cause mortality, insulin sensitivity, central body mass, social connectivity, lifetime wealth accumulation, average income? Think of anything you'd want to be true about you when you're 65. Let's look at the factors that are measurable, predictive, and almost certainly in most cases causally related to, and changeable. Admissions is a little different than changeable, but for my work, I'm really interested in changeable. In which case, what I'm looking at, and the system we ended up building for deciding who Google would hire and who Facebook would hire, is what we call foundational skills or meta-learning. And I mentioned one of them, resilience. Another one is working memory span. Can't really develop that later in life, but it turns out during your first 5 to 8 years, there's a reason why we tell parents to read to their kids. Expand that working memory. That is a malleable thing when you're young, in both directions, unfortunately. But I actually just had a big study published, and then it ended up in the Wall Street Journal, and David Brooks of The Atlantic wrote about it, where we actually had UC Berkeley students predicting the future with or without AI assistance. And it turns out the ones that did the very best working with an AI, in fact, did better than the AIs could do alone and better than the best human beings. What predicted that? It wasn't the benchmarking scores on the AI. They did almost as well with an open source model. It was curiosity, intellectual humility. Curiosity, the AI gave you a good enough answer. Did you keep looking for a better one? Intellectual humility, AI told you were wrong. Did you completely collapse and do everything it said afterwards? Or did you completely ignore it? Or did you take it into account, update, and keep exploring? Fluid intelligence, much better predictor than just G, IQ-ish. And perspective taking. social skill. So if I were building the magic system that said this is who MIT and some unnamed school down the road here should admit, I would do a whole lot of things that would take some time to get into, but if I'm just looking at the individual level, I am probably looking primarily at foundation skills. So next question, some young person, be prepared. My job interview, if you want to work in my lab or at one of my companies, is very simple. Pitch me a mad science experiment. Whatever you want to do to change the world, you're going to come in for an hour, and it's not a dissertation defense. I'm not there to challenge you. We then spend an hour working on it together, trying to figure out how to get it to work. And if we had a better idea together than I would have had by myself, you got the job. You don't know how to program? You don't know anything about brains or machine learning? I can teach you those things. I cannot teach you to have an idea I wouldn't have had. And that's curiosity, resilience, courage, purpose, working memory span. Those are the things that drive those differences. So that's what I would measure. And I wouldn't just argue, I have the evidence to back it up. Those are measurable things. That's what we should be doing right now. And knowing things is important too. Don't get me wrong, but the reason we call them foundational skills is knowing how to factorize a polynomial doesn't do you much good until you have that foundation. After that, it's additive. So when I say universities weren't as predictive as resilience, once you're resilient and you have these other qualities, then suddenly your university degree becomes predictive. All right, somebody else. Come on, please. Someone, there we go.
Navigating a world where AI is increasingly in your kids' lives?
Yeah. Much like a lot of my work, what I find, what I nerd out about in this recent paper of mine and tried to write about in the Wall Street Journal was, it turns out not just AI, social media, the internet in general, isn't good and it isn't bad. Instead, people have what we call heterogeneity. We're all different. What's interesting is that for the majority of people, interacting with AI doesn't look good. In my experiment, 60 to 70% of UC Berkeley students, when they had access to an AI versus when they had to think on their own, a measure of cognitive effort, gamma band activity, dropped by 40%. They just sort of turned off their brain and they simply did whatever the AI said. Continue that for 30 years and we'll have a conversation about Alzheimer's. So I'm genuinely worried about that. We already have the evidence, for example, from automated navigation systems like Google Maps. People that overuse automated navigation are already showing memory problems and some early indicators that they might have higher dementia rates. So, and yet, my whole career is using AI to, I think, do some pretty amazing things. And about 5 to 10% of my participants had something that we called hybrid intelligence. They did the better than the best humans or the best AIs. They produced decisions together neither would have produced on their own. So my real question for kids like my own, growing up in an age of social media and AI and everything else, is how do we build people where they benefit from these technologies rather than are harmed because both of these things are happening? And probably it's like the P.T. Barnum rule. Some of the people are being harmed all the time. All of the people are being harmed some of the time. How does the balance play out in people's lives? So one little thing I did for my kids is I built a little script. I used Claude for this. So I wrote the script. Claude now goes through all of their Gemini and Claude, and it could do it for GPT also. We just don't use it in our household. It runs through all of their history of interactions. And at the end of every week, it builds a little report. Here's where you just did what the AI said without seeming to think about it. Here's where it gave you some good advice, but it seemed like you ignored it. And positive too. Here's where it gave you an idea, and you took it someplace better. So it's like metacognition. At the end of every week, they get a little report that helps them think about their own thinking. Just in this case, think about their hybrid intelligence. It works so well, I started using it. And I will also say, in writing my book, I use something I called the nemesis prompt. I never let it write anything for me. My writing's bad enough already. I don't need Gemini's help in making it worse. And so instead, I said, Gemini, you are my enemy, my lifelong nemesis. You found every mistake I've ever made and pointed it out to the world. Here's the draft of my next chapter. Read it in detail and tell me why I'm wrong, and explain to me how I could make it better. I didn't use AI to make my life easier. I used it to make my life harder in the ways that make me better. And I know that that's kind of like a line, like, sure, but how do I get people to do this when there's fun stuff happening and life is already exhausting? And that's the hard part. Like I was alluding to, the hard part isn't inventing the technologies. It's understanding how people will use them. Sam Altman got up in front of the US Congress and said, imagine a world in which every kid had their own AI tutor, which is great. I can imagine that. In fact, there's a great book called The Diamond Age. Has way too much drug-fueled orgies in it, but that aside, it's about a little book, this AI book that helps people become better. So I can imagine that, but actually we don't have to imagine it. Apparently, Sam Altman doesn't know that we've researched this for 50 years. If there is a golden rule in AI education, is that if the AI ever gives students the answers, they never learn anything, period. So I'm actually building a new system called Socrates, which essentially only gives context and drives the students towards discovering their own answers. And one of the challenges is it has to give them enough to keep them engaged and keep using it without simply giving them the answer. So that's what we're working on. And it's really challenging, but that's my rambling response to you is students booing Eric Schmidt and others giving commencement talks. I get it. These people are dreaming of some perfect science fictional universe that does not exist. Yeah, AI can do amazing things. My life is a testament to that, I would like to believe. But we're the ones who make the world a better place. And the more we outsource ourselves to an AI, the more we're robbing ourselves of that better future. So that's the tension here. How do we have a better relationship? And anyone who tells me about kids that are digital natives or AI natives, all I'm hearing is that the kids from Lord of the Flies are natives to that island. Like, that is you're pitching me a dismal story. We should take ownership of the idea that people can do amazing things and build the support systems, families, schools, and beyond, that allows them to be that best version of themselves. And it's a much harder problem than I'm even giving service to right now, particularly since someone else can just come out and sell the easy, lazy thing at the same time. So it is super challenging, what you're asking about. So just start with yourself and maybe your friends. I think one of the biggest and underappreciated thing is peer role modeling. Peer role modeling is such a potentially positive force in people's lives. And you're already probably a little exceptional, just by virtue that you're here. I'm going to intuit that. Be a peer role model. Show your friends what you can do. Be proud of it. Don't hide that you're a little nerdy. Nerdy is wonderful. Show them the amazing things they could do with these technologies too. And yeah, maybe invent something that makes the world a little bit better. Go plant those trees. All right, I have been told 2 questions, and I want to definitely get to students making their pitches, but do you have something? We should cut, sorry about that. I should shut the hell up because I talk a little too much. If you want to chat to me afterwards, I would be thrilled. Thank you all so much. It's lovely to be in Cambridge.